Let's jump right in. So this is our monthly North America and Europe meeting. This meeting is, of course, being recorded and will be available to everyone to watch afterwards. As we get started, the first thing I want to do is to show our antitrust policy notice slide. So the full Linux Foundation antitrust policy is available on the website. And of course, if you're from a member company, you can ask questions of our council, Andy Updegrove. This meeting has a regular agenda. The agenda can be seen on this screen. We have news. We do any work on standards and core material. Then we have a look at reference and supporting material. We open space for any other business where you can raise any topic related to our project charter, and other activities. And then we close the meeting. Now, the news section this time will be short and focused. In particular, what I wanted to do was to dive into some information about what's been happening in the last couple of weeks. So we've had our community meetings in Korea, Japan, and China in that order, in Seoul, in Tokyo, and in Beijing. We were hosted by one of the large conglomerates in Korea called CJ. They're an organization that started with food products, but now is a major software producer and a major contributor to dealing with open source technology in the Korean market. The Korea Work Group remains one of our most active spaces, with participants that are very familiar, such as SK Telecom, LG Electronics, Samsung, Hyundai, and so on, along with companies that are more well-known in the Korean market than internationally. Over 50 people participated, a series of presentations, mostly in Korean, and a lot of information sharing. To give you a quick summary of what happened there, the focus was primarily on sharing tips and tricks for supply chain management, dealing with compliance and security issues in the supply chain, a lot of attention on software bill of material usage plus AI, and in particular, an emphasis on explaining company process management to each other. The goal of the local community is, of course, to improve how everyone there can work, but our Korean work group is active in contributing that knowledge globally as well. So you'll see them working on things like our reference material. You'll see outcomes being made available generally, and certainly a lot of contributions to our events and workshops. Japan is actually our oldest work group, and its meeting last week was, as usual, pretty active. Again, over 50 participants. The meeting was held at a memory company, Kiosia, which was spun out of Fujitsu and built from a few other companies. It does a lot of work in memory technology and has all kinds of interesting and quirky ways of bringing people together. For example, they had SD card shaped cookies. That's a side note. The main issue at hand is that the Japan community, who originated things like our supplier education leaflet, who originated things like SPDX Lite, are leaning heavily into the next generation of what to do. For example, they've spent a lot of time on discussing how SPDX Lite in the next generation of the 5962 SPDX ISO standard can be included. So in the 3.0 generation of SPDX, how the SPDX Lite profile can and will be included in the future. Our work group in Japan has also spent considerable time on sharing processes, exactly the same as Korea. The Japanese work group has published case studies on process management for a very long time. One of the highlights I saw at the meeting was Toyota, who have done something which our budget might struggle to do. They've created a comic all about how to manage open source for their employees. I've asked them if I can see a copy of that because it seems like an awesome initiative. And it also seems like an incredibly Japanese solution to the challenge of how to educate people on open source, regardless of their directed interest in the field per se. Okay, China then followed. It was the first regular meeting of our China work group. Since 2019, they've been holding workshops and ad hoc meetings, often with quite large attendance, but we're switching to a regular bi-monthly or so meeting schedule to align with Korea and Japan. The first party to step forward as chair of the China work group for regular meetings is a great contributor we have from ByteDance. He's been involved for quite a long time in supporting our community, and he is now going to be leading the work there in terms of holding meetings and in encouraging people to contribute to our community. So Zenwa is stepping up there. And the first meeting was held in the Beijing ByteDance offices with attendees from many organizations. For instance, we had attendees from Honor, that's of course our board member, Huawei, another board member, but also organizations and companies not related to our board and not previously at our main meetings. It was great to get China kicked off on a regular schedule. Main topic there was AI. Quite frankly, AI was number one. Everyone wanted to talk about that. And the number two was general process management. How does that work? What's necessary for open source? And then what type of process management might be needed for AI? AI was a reoccurring theme across Asia. And I have no doubt as we move into a cycle of meetings in Europe, we will see similar things. Okay, the reason I wanted to give you that briefing was to give you a snapshot of what the community itself is thinking and doing. And the fact that we had China, Japan, and Korea meeting inside a 2-week period was pretty special. The main item, of course, is the work on standards and core material. We're going to go through essentially where we're at with the standards and core material. And Chris, with your permission, I'll just give people an update on the general stuff. And then if it's okay, perhaps you could give an impression of, how you felt about visiting the steering committee meeting, and so on. Just kind of a discursive impression of the steering committee and what it'll feel like for our spec community if they send proposals to the steering committee. Is that approach okay for you?
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you very much indeed. So as usual, when we talk about our ISO standards, we look at the open issues and we don't have any. The reason is that on the last call, we closed the remaining issues. So we closed all of the open issues on both of our standards. And that means that the future draft proposals of updates to these standards go into a public comment period so people can see what was raised, what ideas people have for future updates. The public comment period runs for 6 months, then there's a 3-month freeze period, and then finally a formal steering committee vote. So by closing all the issues, thanks to the stewardship of Chris Wood, our chair, we are in a position to say that everything that people had to say about our two standards, since ISO 5230 came out, since ISO 18974 went into ISO, all of those comments and opinions have been recorded and addressed. That ranges from community comments that came in around the world through to specific comments from JTC1 Subcommittee 27, Information Technology Security. There were a bunch of ideas and suggestions regarding scope and so on for the security standard. All of that stuff addressed and in future drafts. With the public comment period about to kick off, well, it just has kicked off, my apologies. It kicked off on June 19th. With that public comment period kicked off, there's a specific process we go into as things get more formal. And I will go through that process in a minute and explain the public comment period that started on the 19th of June and will end on December 19th. But before we do that, as we moved into the public comment period, as we locked down things, that meant not only triggering the public comment period, but also sending that information that we're going into public comments to the steering committee. Between now and the end of the public comment period, there will have been a total of 3 steering committee meetings. So one just happened. We had a steering committee meeting adjacent to a board meeting on the 26th and into the 27th of June. Another will happen in September, and another will happen in November, adjacent to board meetings. The steering committee is made up of the voting members of the OpenChain board. So that's representatives from the Platinum member companies, plus the chair of specification work group, and that's Chris, our elected chair. Those voting participants of the steering committee are ultimately the parties who decide if the draft changes to the standards are accepted, who decide what to do with public comments, and so on and so forth. So by the end of this year, as the public comment period ends, we'll have gone from the steering committee being aware we're going to the public comment period, and then having 2 chances to consider and potentially begin to formulate their opinions regarding the new updated suggested future versions of the standards and people's response to them. After the public comment period, we go into a freeze period, during which time there will be a further meeting of the steering committee, and that will be ultimately when some final decisions are made regarding whether or not to update the standards. So our work here in the spec group is where we've done an awful lot of editing, preparing, and so on and so forth, but it will also be obviously critical to see what the steering committee does, and they have the final decision. With that in mind, I just wanted to say, Chris attended his first steering committee meeting, and to see if he could give some impressions of the atmosphere and approach so people can know what to expect of the steering committee meetings. And with that said, the steering committee meetings are not private. They are going to be available for people to see. So the steering committee meetings are a meeting where we make decisions about the standards, we record those decisions, and we're sharing those. But beyond the dry facts of what the steering committee does, Chris, I wondered if you could share a few impressions of how it was when you attended the meeting, and how you think we can most effectively communicate with the steering committee in the months ahead during the public comment period and during the freeze period.
Yeah, I thought that the steering committee meeting was pretty enlightening. Just because I hadn't been to one before on this project, and I am very interested in seeing how the public comments are flowed to us, and then as well for awareness, as well as the steering committee uh, taking a look at them, and to see if this time interval of 6 months and 3 months is reasonable, to maybe make some recommendations once we get through and actually get the changes submitted to ISO for updating our standards. Then we could make a recommendation up through Shane and back to the steering committee and the board as to the appropriateness of that length of time. I'm almost thinking being involved with public comment periods with other other spec review teams. They're not called public review, but they're a call for comments from all of the people that participate. And it seems like you get an initial flurry of comments and suggestions, and then it all goes quiet. And uh, it was about 6 months quiet on one that I just worked that's about ready to go to ISO from IEEE. And that's way too long. Everybody kind of loses focus to where they are. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. And that was my biggest takeaway coming out of the meeting.
That's a really good point, Chris. And the initial public comment period and freeze period for the OpenChain project was not 6 months and 3 months, but rather it was I believe 6 weeks public comment and 2 weeks freeze period.
Hmm.
But those schedules were originally created when the open source community doing compliance was a lot smaller and there were much fewer participants globally, I think, in talking about this type of process as opposed to potentially just reacting to customer company requests. So, we've done a couple of years building the spec, and a lot of the stakeholders were regarded as having contributed. The change which came last year to a 6 month and 3 month period was due to a view by the board and uh, you know primary members of steering committee that we were probably dealing with a much larger demographic who might have something to say on this. But it doesn't mean that that particular period length is set in stone, and your point is very well taken. We can and will be in an excellent position to provide feedback to the board with this comment period. If there's a flurry of comments and it drops off, then that is valuable feedback to provide. So I think we should do that. And Chris, the second thing I wanted to touch on was related to the public comments. My current communications plan is to channel all of the public comments into the spec mailing list and onto GitHub. So we should have them first, and then I'll summarize them every 3 months for the steering committee. Would you be amenable to that approach? Do you think that would be good for transparency?
Yeah, I do. I think that that will allow anybody else out there in the open source community who wants to at least have a chance to make inputs to do so. So I think it'll be real good for transparency.
That would be great. And, ideally, we want to make sure that everyone everywhere can see every detail of this. The steering committee has the final vote on whether these drafts go into updates to the ISO standards. But the work we've done on developing these drafts and the work we will do in collecting and providing editorial and public comments will be invaluable. And, you know, Chris, I don't know what your impression is, but I think in the last 2 years or so, as we've worked on this, we've already invited a ton of stakeholders in. I mean, I think we might have already done terrific reach. So I feel like we already have a pretty good temperature on the market of what people were thinking. I don't know if you would concur with that impression.
Yeah, I agree with that impression. I think that one of the things that a public comment period may help is the people who don't feel quite as comfortable speaking out in the meetings or going into GitHub and making comments to make comments uh, in a more anonymous type forum and and get their 2 cents in because I'm sure that there are people who attend some of our monthly meetings, whether it's the Asia or the Europe and North American calls, who
Absolutely.
who who have things that are bothering them a little bit. And so it would be a good opportunity for them to document that and submit it in the public comment period.
Absolutely. And at every meeting I was at, I was showing this slide. So China, Japan, Korea, this slide went up, and I was talking through what we've done and why, and making it clear to people that there's plenty of opportunity to do this. And to your point, supportive of the idea of capturing voices that might be hesitant to speak up as well as new voices, I wanted to inform you that our um, media outreach, our social media outreach has dramatically increased in the OpenChain project in the last 6 weeks. Primary focus is on LinkedIn and professional channels, for instance, groups and so on. And OpenChain is already and will continue to post not only general points about the public comment period, but targeted items about how to give your view on the licensing spec, how to give your view on the security spec, and so on and so forth, to try and solicit that if parties have a comment, uh, they can and should submit it and how to do it. So, yeah.
Sounds good.
Just out of curiosity, and I'll go straight then to explaining the process again, which is partially for the people on the call and also partially for those watching the recording. Chris, how long are the common periods that you've encountered on other standards projects?
The other standard projects like IEEE and ANSI here in the United States, which is our national body, and the ISO process is a lot more closed community, and so the comment periods are generally fairly, they're not, it doesn't seem like, let me rephrase that. It doesn't seem like they have a standard length of time that they keep those open. But when they open them up, uh, they just put them out on a board and they send out a distribution to everyone. And then everyone who is a member of, for example, in SC27, which is the cybersecurity, or SC42, which is the AI ISO groups, the messages are all contained with people who actually have a membership in those work groups. And there's 5 or 6 work groups in each one of those, cybersecurity and in AI. And those are the only people who really get to make comments on it. But it's very interesting from the other standpoint, other than there's just a flood of them, is that it gives you an opportunity to go and look at all of the other specifications that are being developed and actually make comments, which there's some very good comments that come in because people are looking at it with an eye toward how I developed my spec. And they're expecting that because this is a complementary spec that's related to it within the overall community of, say, cybersecurity, but you don't usually look at all of the other specifications that are being developed in some of the other work groups. And so what is like the public comment period within that community allows, it notifies everybody that, hey, we've got a working draft that's ready to go, or we've got a request to do new work in such and such an area, or we've got a disk that's ready and we want to publish this spec. And do you think it's ready to go? So there's different levels, but it does give everybody a chance. And because everybody's a member of the larger work group, we get some very good comments that come out of it. Sometimes way too many.
Uh, that's, I think, something that is a point well taken. I'm hoping that we will get some comments, but a manageable amount. And of course, in our public comment period, we're not seeking to re-edit the spec, but we are seeking to take into account feedback on it. And certainly, great ideas can be included in future iterations as well. Chris, for your reference, two specific items of let's go talk with other standards people. We had JTC1 Subcommittee 27 IT security uh, take a look at the security standard just before we handed it over to the JTC1 past transposition process.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to check we're not overlapping with you guys and so on and so forth. And they provided feedback that we seem to be in alignment with where they're going. We also got a bunch of editorial suggestions. The ones that were directly relevant, we folded in. And then we got a bunch of ideas and scope suggestions that we put into future standard drafting. And we've just completed that. We closed all their issues. So I'll be going back to JGC1 Subcommittee 27 and saying, here's the draft of the security spec. It's in a public comment period. What do you think? And given the last time we had a bunch of notes from them, I suspect we might get something back. Another thing is that I'll be talking with sister ISO standards like SPDX. They do the SBOM and saying, here's where we're at. Do you have any comments and so on and so forth. Equally, Chris, if you've got avenues into people who deal with standards around compliance and security that may see relevance with our open source work, yeah, please do reach out to them and let them know that their voice is more than welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's was quite a bit of interest from the engineers within the IEEE organization on doing an open source spec, but it got so convoluted that they gave it up. And so yeah, I think they might be interested in uh, looking at the cybersecurity aspects of the security assurance spec. They don't have anything that I think is like licensing in the detail that we go into it, because most of the software that they deal with is all licensed by private parties, although that is really starting to change in industry. And that's why I'm glad that we've got some major companies that are hopping on and saying that they're conformant in both the security assurance specification and in the open source licensing spec.
And for those of you who are wondering if the public comment period is not designed for substantive changes, what happens with those? The answer is those go into next draft update. And we always start looking at the future's future as we deal with a potential update to an ISO standard. So we'll be able, willing, and ready to capture scope suggestions as well. Those scope suggestions will not be put into the current drafts. Chris, with your permission, I'll just remind people of the process so they have a clear idea of how we
Yes.
do this. Alrighty. So I've got a 1, 2, 3 here. Basically, we look at our mission and vision and say, what are we doing? And we have that on our FAQ. So, our vision is a supply chain that is trusted, and our mission is to make that happen. That's our context. That's what we're thinking. Then when it comes to developing the standards, 4 guiding principles since we were founded. Build trust around the supply chain. Remember that less is more. We don't want to make big standards. We want key requirements, solving real problems, not seeking abstract ideals, not seeking to solve all the details. Keep our specifications to what and why, not the how and when. In other words, we identify the process points. We don't tell people how to fill out the processes. We want to make sure that different implementations are available to solve any challenge. We do not want to lock people into specific process content. We want to make sure that every industry, every company of every size can use these standards and has their freedom to operate. Now, the development process itself is wordy, so don't worry. You are not meant to and do not have to read all of this right now. But in essence, we have a defined, clearly mapped, and battle-proven way of developing our specs. And this has been applied since day one. This is what has led to our two ISO standards. The only substantive change in our history is extending public comments from 6 weeks to 9 months. Oh, sorry, 6 months. That's a typo. 6 months, and then a freeze period of 3 months. So the time from when we say this draft looks cooked to when it can potentially be voted as an updated standard is 9 months. So public comment period happens at the 9 months before final vote, runs for 6 months, and then freeze period for 3 months after that. Originally 6 weeks and 2 weeks, but it's a much broader community now. In the chat, you'll see the link to the FAQ and you can see all of that. As part of this process, now that public comments have kicked off, I'm showing this slide to explain to people that they have a 6-month public comment period and then there'll be a 3-month freeze period. And what I'm currently doing to socialize our work is sharing a few specific slides. And by the way, these slides have all just been mailed to the spec list, so you should have a copy. I'm showing some of the key suggested changes to each draft standard. So I'm showing the current ISO standard, giving people access to the next gen draft, flagging where the issues are at, and highlighting again the actual spec development process. To explain to people what we've been doing visually, I've grabbed a few items from each of the standards. For example, I highlight that when it comes to 5230, we've reordered sections of it to make the reading maybe more logical. I highlight, for instance, there's a typo in 5230's proposed draft. That's the type of error that the public comment period is there to catch. And I will be opening an issue against that on GitHub, which is partially designed to flag the actual error, but also partially to be there so people can see precisely how to comment. I talk about how the market has evolved since 2016. In 2016, software bill of materials was not really understood very well, especially in open source. Now it's different. In fact, now there's government regulations saying have a software bill of materials. With that in mind, we've changed some of the language in our definitions to reflect it. I go on to show, for instance, how we've improved our language in this slide. It's just on the rationale. We went from reasonable commercial efforts to reasonable efforts because, of course, we're primarily dealing with the commercial supply chain, but there are areas such as governmental work, especially outside the US, where the phrasing needed to be slightly different. And then I highlight what's the biggest suggested change, which is the duration. Currently, our ISO standard says to double check conformance every 18 months. There's a proposal that we have from our work group to change that to an annual period. So for example, revised every 12 months is in the current draft. I already got some feedback on that. Some people think annual cycle great, but maybe that's too short. Maybe it should be every 24 months. And some people think maybe it could be even longer, 36. That's one of those items that's likely to, I think, get some of the feedback on our GitHub and mailing list pretty soon. On the security side, exactly the same approach, current standard, next gen standard, where the open issues are, the common period. And oops, and then the 3-month freeze period. The examples shown are, for instance, on the security standard, we reordered sections of it to make it more readable. In this case, we went from the list of sentences saying what was required for standard practice implementation to make it just easier to read those sentences, especially for non-native speakers. I highlight again language structural changes which don't change the requirements of the standard, try to make it quicker and easier to understand. And then one item under security assurance where we went from saying having a process to do this to saying having a process to do this like da, 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 because people did highlight to us that especially, let's say, OSPOs trying to dig into this might not really have a security background and might need some guidance. So NIST SP 830 is cited as an example of a program that could be operational. And then the duration, of course, security aligns with licensing on timing, and that means we talk about that duration. Again, that's likely to solicit probably the most feedback as people give their favorite duration responses. All right, does anyone have any questions about that? The process, the way it's presented, any ideas of how we can do this better in the public comment period? All right, if there's no specific feedback on this, then essentially you can expect me to be socializing the public comment period slides. And these type of overviews across social media to other projects and so on as we try to bring them in and encourage them to contribute. Just opening. Oh,
Do
hi,
have
Mary. How are you doing?
good. And I have a question regarding maybe not only OpenChain, it's more like from the governance aspects. For many companies which have like group, one big group have many like child company. For example, like Sony have a lot of sub or not sub company, child company, like Geely Group have a lot of car brand company, Volvo car, Polestar, Zeekr, etc. So I'm thinking from these aspects, from the governance aspects, it's like group have the open source governance or Osborne stuff, and each child company have one, or how it is usually kind of set up, or it doesn't matter. Each company can play themselves.
It's a great question, and the fundamental answer is from our perspective, it doesn't matter. It's up to them. In practice, I can tell you that most companies tend to have scoped programs on our ISO standards. Not every company. For instance, some companies such as Bosch are whole entity conformant, but most companies have scoped programs in a legal entity, scoped to covering certain parts of the business, maybe some product team, maybe a department, whatever. The scoping is up to them. Our standard does not tell them how big their compliance or security program should be. We just tell them what are the key requirements for a quality one. Anyway, most companies have a scoped program in a legal entity that touches open source. And if there's a bunch of legal entities, they have scoped programs in each entity. Some companies use OSPOs as a central point for organizing their open source. Is that directly connected with our ISO standards? Yes and no. OSPOs frequently use our ISO standards, but the choice of the scoping for the implementation of the ISO standard, the choice of the program size, again, it doesn't have to be covering all of the things the OSPO is doing. So it totally depends on the company, the market, and their decisions. Purposefully, just picking one concrete example, you mentioned Sony. It's a great example of a group company, tons of subsidiaries around the world. An organization like Hitachi has over 1,000 legal entities in Japan alone. So as you can imagine, some of those legal entities are particularly relevant to open source, like someone doing services for automotive. Some of them are not. For instance, the people manufacturing the axles for the Shinkansen bullet train. So very much depends on the legal entity, very much depends on how they want to scope, totally up to them. We don't have guidance on that purposefully, but we can give you millions of examples. Well, okay, not millions, many examples of what companies do in practice. And the answer is they choose what suits them best. And when it comes to specific implementation, some companies manage open source through OSPO, some manage it through IP, some manage it through product teams. That doesn't really matter for our standards. Any of those parties can pick up our standards and begin using them in a scoped compliance or security program. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, I see. So in this case, it's kind of independent. So like if a group company joins any kind of open source organization, it doesn't mean it's not on behalf of all of its child company in this case.
Yeah, usually so, indeed. And just picking out your example, you lead the OSPO at Volvo. Geely Group owns Volvo, and Geely Group owns so many other companies just in Europe alone. We're talking about Lotus. We're talking about LEVC, which used to be London Electric Vehicle Company. It was the taxi company. We're talking about 50% of Smart. In your case, for Geely, it would really be about Geely companies each deciding what they're up to. Maybe Volvo will have a program, maybe Polestar will have a program, maybe Lynk & Co will have a program in China, maybe Zeekr will have a program, whether it's implemented in an OSPO or in another way. It's up to them, market condition, and using our standards, again, entity by entity. And it's probably important here to differentiate between a company joining a project for something like code development and someone picking up an ISO standard. So I'll give you a quick example. Hypothetically speaking, if there was a company that owned 100% of all its subsidiaries, then let's say that company, let's call it Company A, joins Linux Foundation and then joins a project like OpenChain. Under Linux Foundation rules, that company, if it owns 100% of each of its subsidiaries, that company and all of its subsidiaries are involved in that membership. Standards are totally different in that a standard is something that you pick up and implement. Your legal entity will pick it up and implement it or not. If you have 100 legal entities, each legal entity will pick it up and implement it or not. So it's quite different from, let's say, membership of a trade association, membership of an open source project that has membership fees or project charter, et cetera, et cetera. ISO standard is a very different creature, but any questions, any help you need around that, we're super happy to provide. And that comment isn't specific to you and on Volvo, because Mary, I know you've been involved with us for a long time. You're well aware of the details of this, but to everyone listening to this recording, if you have questions about how to use the standards, how to use them in your OSPO, how to use them in your IP department, product team, or how to use them in your group, we're totally ready to help you, lend a hand, introduce you to your peers, and get them to explain to you what they did and why.
Thank you very much for your answer.
You're super welcome. It's a really good question. And so many group companies are using our standards that, it's extremely, extremely valid question. All right. We're running. Oh, Chris, over to you.
Well, that was a really good question, and it got me to thinking a little bit that if you have and I agree with everything that Shane has said about it's really up to a company to determine how they do this. But if the companies, all of the subsidiaries or related businesses within business areas within a major organization decide that reuse of the open source software is going to make it better for them, either from a legal perspective or a security perspective, or just from a cost perspective of not having 16 people certifying this, the same piece of open source software for licensing, uh, then they could all have used the same process. But if you're doing such different work that there's very little overlap between the business entities, then it doesn't really make much difference. That was my thought.
That's a really good point. And, I think Sony might be a good example of trying to find a great balance here in that Sony Group has an OSPO. It's got some great open source people. And I know that regardless of whether it's, a Sony department in, for instance, the United States or a Sony department in another region or area, the central team is at the group is on hand to answer questions and to find shared efficiencies. So yeah, we don't have requirements on that, but of course it makes sense. Alrighty, because we're heading towards the top of the hour, I'll jump in and just talk a little bit about the reference material. The real news is that there's a meeting tomorrow, and the meeting is suitable for people in North America and Europe. I just put the link to it. Basically, there's a ton of work going on in education on reference material. You are invited. There's a lot of interesting stuff, particularly things like the explainers for different government departments. And we've already released some cool material, like the recent update to the supplier education guide and the updated training slides and so on and so forth. You'll be seeing more and more communication about the released material. You'll be seeing more and more opportunities to work on the forthcoming material, and it's highly recommended to be on that call. I'm going to talk to Andrew about during the public comment period, if he can also join this monthly call, perhaps to give a summary of where the deeper dive calls go. But for now, go join the monthly call for education. That is definitely where there's a lot of cool work being done. All right, and throwing open the door, is there any other business? All right, if there's no other business, we're moving to the close of this meeting, and I'll just highlight once again that you got the slides from this meeting. I'll probably have a double check and see if I made any typos preparing them. It is 2 a.m. here, and I was preparing them just after midnight, so I do apologize if there was any error. But you have the slides I just showed you. Any updates will be sent to the list. Just check your email. And if you can use the slides, sections of the slides to help socialize the public comment period, that's great. If you want to refer to how to get to the education meeting tomorrow or to have a look at how they're doing stuff like maturity modeling, no problem. Open the slides, have a look. So 2 weeks from now, we'll have our North America Asia meeting for the spec work group. I'll let you know how the public comment period is going. Chris and I are always on hand to help this process go through, and huge thanks, Chris, to stewarding us to this point. Big thanks to Mary for an excellent question, and my most sincere hope that I was coherent enough on this call. And I guarantee my coherence on the Asia call in our normal time zone here. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you, you too.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.